Amina, can the participants ask questions directly, or will you be moderating? I can't hear you.
Sorry, I got muted. So
Amina will be moderating.
Yeah. So the format would be that the participants, some of them had already posted the question, which I also shared with you, which can be
Yes.
the format of even your talk today. And also after your talk, there will be an open Q&A, and the participants are encouraged to post their queries, their questions in the chat box. So from the chat box, I will pick up the questions and for you to respond.
Okay.
This will be that for today. So a lot of our faculties from from Jamia Millia Islamia are also joining in gradually. A lot of them are our own students and scholars who are working within the domain of gender and Islam and women and gender broadly, and some of them have also joined us from across globe. I can see my colleagues from Turkey. Some of them are from England. So it's a good eclectic mix.
Good.
And multiple time zones also.
Yes, we are addressing gathering from multiple time zones. So shall we now begin, ma'am? Because I will be admitting people. I'll continue to admit them. All right, Preeti, are you there? So the questions have already started pouring in. So I guess, well, let's wait for the professor to first open the session, and then we will entertain the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, Preeti, can you please begin now?
You're muted.
Amina, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So yeah, I have to constantly also let people in. Anyways, good evening, Assalamu alaikum, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. A very warm welcome to this yet again distinguished lecture series celebrating 25 years of Sarojini Naidu Center for Women's Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia. And I would like to officially now open this session for today. And I would like to do so by, of course, thanking our respected, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia, Professor Mazhar Asif, whose vision and commitment continue to guide Jamia Millia Islamia as one of India's leading higher education. We recently got the 4th ranking, the NRF 4th ranking. And I would also like to extend my deep appreciation and gratitude to our Honorable Registrar, Professor Mehtab Alam Rizvi, who's been very, very supportive, and his support has been really vital in organizing these events and sustaining and expanding these academic initiatives at our center. Now, allow me to take a moment to also acknowledge the leadership, I should say, a dynamic leadership of Professor Nishad Zaidi, who is the director of our center, Sarojini Naidu Center for Women's Studies, and she's also the convener of these distinguished lecture series, and was the former head of the English department, Jamia Millia Islamia. And her guidance and her mentorship, has really not only carried forward the mandate, of the women's centers, Sarojini Naidu Center for Women's Studies, but has also, I guess, become, it has become a very vibrant and intellectual space that brings the scholarship activism and public engagement, whether it's through international collaborations or conferences or this very distinguished lecture series, symposiums. She has positioned SNCWS as a hub of critical feminist thought. And I guess it won't be far-fetched to say that, its presence felt across the academia and the public spheres. So thank you, ma'am, for that, for giving us these opportunities again and again. And also, of course, the distinguished speaker for today, Professor Asma Barlas, our director of MAM will, she will officially introduce our distinguished speaker. But I would just like to personally thank her, because I know she's not very well, and I have obstinately kind of pursued her for this talk. So I just want to thank you for being here, for being so kind, as I said, and so warm. So thank you so much. With this, I ask Preeti to please take over.
Thank you so much, Preeti, and thanks, Amina, for your very kind words. Professor Barlas, it is really, I don't have words to express our gratitude to you. It's a huge honor and joy for me and for all of us here to welcome you tonight to this distinguished lecture series. In the past, we have had scholars like Professor Laila Abulogat and Professor Linda Alcoff Martin. So, it's very interesting the way we are building this trajectory of, talks in this series. And I'm sure our scholars will find new vistas, new avenues for research and research ideas from these talks. Now, to formally introduce Professor Barlas, I must say that I was totally impressed and awed by the trajectory of career that she has followed. First of all, her education itself. She did her BA in English Literature and Philosophy. English literature being mine as well as Amina's subject, so I found it very fascinating. Then she did MA in Journalism, also MA in International Studies. Then she went on to write her PhD in International Studies, and she wrote her thesis on a very interesting subject, a subject that interests me personally hugely. That is the analysis of politics of the subcontinent before, and you have written about the politics of the subcontinent before and after the partition. So it's very interesting how closely you have observed this, closely you have followed the communal, relations as it evolved in these, countries after the partition and before the partition in the subcontinent. So it's very fascinating. Then Professor Barlas, in her career also has been very adventurous. She began her career as a diplomat, then she moved on to journalism, and then finally to academics. So it's very fascinating how you have been pursuing things that you enjoyed, and sort of the kind of liberated approach that you have had. Unlike us who really follow very structured and blinkered approach. So it's fascinating, Professor Barlas. And then your work, the most influential, of course, believing women in Islam, which I think has influenced across scholars across the world. Whoever wants to work in the area of Islam, women, or anything that has to do with gender and Islam has to look at this work. So it has become a kind of must read for all of us. And it's very interesting that this book, which was published in 2002, the revised edition came out in 2019, and the revised edition then had a joint introduction, which you wrote along with a colleague. Then Professor Barlas has also, published other books. Uh, she has published this Re-Understanding Islam, a double critique, which is basically a compilation of Spinoza lectures, as I understand. It was published in 2008. Then she published Discovery, Nationalism, and Communalism, which was published in 2000. 18 or 2018, right? And then you also published one more book which you have listed under a trade book for whatever reason. It is called Islam, Muslims and the US, Essays on Religion and Politics. What makes Professor Barlas stand out is not only her intellectual rigor but also her ethical grounding. She has consistently refused to let women's rights be framed as external to Western imposition, instead demanding that gender justice flows from within the Quran itself. And it's a very interesting argument because throughout, and even in our informal conversation before this lecture, she kept saying that she's a Muslima, not a feminist, and she began reading Quran at a very young age. So her critique of Islam and her critique of Muslim patriarchy comes not from outside the structure but from within the structure. So this is something that is really fascinating. What makes what makes us very interested in Professor Barlas's scholarship is the kind of debate that it has inspired and it has sparked. Uh, and it has inspired students and younger scholars to engage with transnational field of Islamic feminist ideas, which is also which is not just interesting but also challenging, because it's very easy to critique Islam from outside, but difficult to stay within the fold and then critique. So your intellectual journey, Professor Barlas, is really a reminder to all of us that scholarship can be both resistance and devotion, and resistance and devotion are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can exist together. So thank you so much for being with us. Over to you for your thoughts.
Well, assalamu alaikum and greetings, dear colleagues, and thank you, professors, both of you, for inviting me to give this lecture. This is certainly the warmest, heartwarming introduction I've ever been given. And just for the record, I didn't leave the Foreign Service for journalism. I was kicked out by Ziaul Haq for having called him a buffoon. So in any case, that's, as I keep saying, another story.
And you did, huh?
Yeah, at least I had the satisfaction of being able to say that. I'm very happy to be with you, and the reason I'm keeping my comments to about 30 minutes or so is because I'm also asthmatic, and it's difficult for me to talk for long periods of time at a stretch. But on the good side, think of it this way: we'll have more time for a dialogue, or at least as much time for a dialogue. Basically, I'll be speaking about why I believe that reading the Quran as a male privileging text is both theologically and methodologically unsound and even indefensible. And also why I read it as, and indeed consider it to be, egalitarian and anti-patriarchal. So I'll begin by outlining some problems with the Quran's patriarchal or male privileging tafsir. And then I'll recap some features of my own approach, and I will end by reviewing some secular feminist critiques of my reading and of the Quran. And to be clear, I use the word and the term secular feminists for those who call the Quran androcentric, and on that basis question if it is God's word in the name of, quote, feminist justice and or the Mu'tazila's doctrine of the created Quran. So the best example of the Quran's male-centric tafsir must be known to all of you. It is that of verse 434, to the effect that a male God prefers men, makes them women's custodians, which is the word, that's how the word kavamun is translated, and gives them the right to hit or beat either who, rebellious or disobedient, that's to say nushuz, wives. But despite its canonicity, this tafsir is grounded in two demonstrable theological fallacies. First, it depicts God as male, simply because the Quran uses male pronouns for God. However, this is because it is in a gendered language that cannot accurately reflect divine ontology, that is to say, the nature of God's being. The Quran itself makes this clear by stating, and the verses I'll be citing from the Quran are from Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation. This is one of the Quls, that is to say, Surah 112. I quote, God is God, the one and only, God, the eternal, absolute. God begetteth not, nor is God begotten, and there is none like unto God. End quote. For this reason, the Quran says, use not similitudes, that is to say, comparisons for God. I would think this is evidence enough for us not to confuse the signified and the signified, that is God, with the Quran's or our own language about God. Paradoxically, though, while professing a belief in God's inimitability, Muslims have always masculinized God, and not only linguistically. Consider the texts in our part of the world, by which I mean India and Pakistan, that posit a symbolic and even literal continuum between God and men by calling husbands their wives earthly gods, majazi khuda, whom wives must serve and obey as they would God, quote, himself. This male worship, which gives men sovereignty over women, is the second theological fallacy, since the Quran is adamant that only God is sovereign and God's sovereignty is indivisible. This is the very essence of the doctrine of Tawheed. So, for instance, in explaining why God has no partners, the Quran says if there had been many gods, quote, each would have taken away what each had created, and some would have lorded it over others. Surah 33, verse 91. The Quran is equally clear that human beings aren't each other's sovereigns either, by asking us to recite, and this is Surah 3, verse 34. We worship none but God. We associate no partners with God. We erect not from among ourselves lords and patrons other than God, end quote. And to do any of this is shirk, a derogation of divine unity, and the only sin the Quran says God will not forgive. So again, there is no clearer evidence that the Quran itself invalidates a tafsir that masculinizes God and or deifies men. As to its methodological flaws, I will list three. First, readings of 434 are premised on rendering idribu as hit or beat, when it also means to leave, cite as it refers, turn away from, etc. And the Quran itself uses it in many different ways. But even if we were to read idribu as beat, the Quran hasn't framed it as an obligatory command for a couple. By this I mean idribu is a potential measure of last resort for a husband, and it does not say that a wife must take a beating. She could very well leave her husband before they reach that stage. I'll return to this point a bit later. A second methodological problem with 434's classical tafsir is that it negates all the other verses about marriage in the Quran, each one of them. Cumulatively, these verses counsel love, forbearance, sukoon, and mutuality between spouses by, for instance, instructing a husband to, quote, deal kindly with a wife, even if he dislikes her, is divorcing her, she is his enemy, or he sees her committing adultery. In such a case, he must refer her to the legal authorities, and if she denies his charge, the Quran doesn't permit any reprisals against her. In other words, it doesn't say a husband can beat a lewd or adulterous wife, which then raises the question as to why it would let him beat someone who disobeys him. As to the word kawamun, the Quran's patriarchal tafsir takes it as proof that God prefers men and I quote an old exegete, the completeness of mental ability, good counsel, and power in the performance of duties. While other exegetes claim that men are superior to women since God created the woman from and after the man and for his pleasure or service. However, a tafsir along these lines negates all the other verses about human creation and moral individuality in the Quran, which affirm that there is no hierarchy of being in it, by teaching that God created women and men from a single nafs, named them Khalifa on earth, and made them each other's awliya. So let me quote this. Awliya means mutual caretakers. This is Surah 9, verse 72. The believers, men and women, are awliya, one of another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, practice regular charity, and obey God and God's apostle. On them will God pour God's mercy, end quote. In fact, 434 itself says husbands are qawwamun, not because they're superior to women, but because they provide for their wives. In other words, it's their social role and moral and ethical obligation. Yet Muslim patriarchies have transformed an ethics of care and responsibility into proof of male sovereignty, and the idea that men are the heads of their families. However, the Quran never refers to a man as a sort of a pater familias, that is, as a ruler with the power of life and death over his wives and children, which is how they were regarded in ancient Rome, and frankly are in Muslim patriarchies today. Finally, classical tafsir has parochialized the Quran by tying it to a 7th century tribal Arab patriarchy, by treating its forms of male authority over women as normative rather than as having been historically contingent. And the reason exegetes have given for not historicizing these verses about men's authority is that it would undermine the Quran's universalism. But to be clear, what makes the Quran universal is that it is God's eternal and binding word for Muslims, and not on how human beings interpret it. Moreover, as I've just pointed out, protecting archaic forms of men's authority has generated a view of God who bears no resemblance to God in the Quran. So these problems, and in particular the feminist claim that, quote, Islam is a religious patriarchy that has God on its side, this was some woman called Fatma Sabah, were the points of departure for my own reading of the text. And this reading is based on two premises. One is that since the Quran is God's word, we need to read it in light of God's self-disclosure as manifest in the Quran. In other words, the statements the Quran makes about God. To this end, I focus on the theologies of God's unity, inimitability, and justice, so as to draw out their implications for patriarchal ideologies of male privilege. Briefly, and I'm simplifying, since the doctrine of Tawheed affirms God's unity and the indivisibility of God's sovereignty, I take it as a given that ascribing male dominion over women to the Quran amounts to shirk. Similarly, God's inimitability means God is above sex and gender and also sexual partisanship, which then refutes what I consider to be the heresy that a male God prefers men and that there is any equivalence between their authority. Lastly, the Quran describes God's justice negatively as not doing zulm. And its meaning in the Quran, according to Toshihiko Izutsu, is, and I quote him, to transgress the proper limit and encroach upon the right of some other person. However, if God abjures zulm, doesn't do zulm, then I consider any tafsir that projects zulm against women into the Quran to be a misreading. And for skeptics in the audience, I do explain what counts as an appropriate reading from a hermeneutical perspective in my book. My second premise is that if we are to claim that the Quran is patriarchal or anti-patriarchal, we need to define patriarchy itself. And this may seem like an obvious point, but when I finished Believing Women, which was in 1999, not a single critic who had called Islam patriarchal had clarified the term itself. Even Amina Wadud, whose book appeared the same year, didn't explain what she meant when she said that the Quran is, quote, neutral to social patriarchy and marital patriarchy. So I offer a twofold definition. The first is along the lines of the pater familias, which is the tradition of father/husband rule over women and children. And this this particular form of patriarchy, at least the religious forms of this patriarchy also depict God as male and father. And based on a reading of Quranic verses pertaining to everything from how the Quran speaks about God to marriage, divorce, sexuality, and so on, I then illustrate that it doesn't support this type of patriarchy and in fact challenges it, since God is not male or father, and indeed rejects being patriarchalized, in other words, being called father. Also, the Quran more directly undermines father right by criticizing those who follow the ways of their fathers. That's a phrase from the Quran, in preference to God's. In other words, it directly juxtaposes God's rule and father right, and with the intent of displacing father right. And this is also evident in the stories of how God saves the Prophet Abraham from his father's attempts to have him killed, and later on saves Abraham's son from him. The second definition of patriarchy I offered was as a contemporary secular politics of sexual differentiation that depicts men and women as not only different, but also as opposites and unequal by mapping gender onto biological sex. I borrowed this from Zeel Eisenstein, who's written about patriarchy. So to explain this, because it sounds really complicated, it's not. Gender is the cultural meaning that human beings have given to biological sex, and this meaning has changed over time. For instance, the early Greeks held that there was only the male sex, and that women were just lesser and defective men. In modern times, Europeans came up with the two-sex model, in which the man appears as the self and the woman as his negation or other. And currently, as you know, the trend is not only to dispense with gender binaries, but also to de-link sex from gender. And I also want to point out that some indigenous societies have no concept of gender whatsoever. This may surprise you, but neither does the Quran, despite all of the feminist references to its hierarchy verses. I say this because while it refers to men and women and their social roles, the Quran doesn't ascribe any meaning to biological sex, for instance, by saying men have X gender attributes because they are biological males, or that women have Y because they are biological females. There is therefore also no self-other binary in it, which is why I argue that it doesn't support the second type of patriarchy. As for the male privileging verses, since there is no concept of gender in the Quran, I can't very well claim that it advocates gender hierarchy. Besides, these very verses are a testament to how the Quran altered the existing gender roles of a 7th century society to women's advantage. It's easy for us to forget that when we read the Quran from the present. But at that time, which is 7th century Arabia, it restricted men's dominion over women by giving women rights in marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. I would say also in testimony. And these are rights that women didn't have anywhere in the world at the time, and they still don't in Muslim societies. At the same time, the Quran also forbade men to, quote, inherit women against their will. In other words, it imputed a will to women in the 7th century, banned a form of divorce on a wife's appeals, banned repeatedly divorcing the same wife or turning her out of their home during a divorce. It redefined polygyny by making it conditional on securing the welfare of orphans, and it prohibited the killing of girls and children. Additionally, the Quran spoke to men and women as equals in outlining religious beliefs, conduct, and moral personality. Amina, here I would appreciate your putting the verse.
Preeti, can you please share the slide? Okay, wait. Yes, please share the slide.
Okay, should I go ahead?
Yes, I think we're sharing the screen, that code that you wanted to read out. It will be on the screen in a minute.
Okay, so this is Surah 35, verse 33. For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast and deny themselves, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in God's praise. For them has God prepared forgiveness and great reward. Predictably, though, we rarely hear such verses being recited by those who like to quote 434 ad nauseum. At most, if one brings up such verses, one hears that women may be equal to men in God's sight, but they aren't so in men's. And I can't help but call this nothing but Iblisian logic and hubris. Iblis, by the way, is the angel who fell from grace and is the Muslim equivalent, I suppose, of Satan. Finally, I interpret the Quran in light of its own suggested criteria, such as reading it as a whole, contextually, and for its best meanings. The Quran's support for textual holism emerges from God's warning to those who, quote, divided scripture into arbitrary parts and made the Quran into shreds. That's Surah 15, verses 89 to 93. The Quran also praises those who say, quote, we believe in the book, the whole of it is from God. Surah 3, verse 7. And it commends those, I quote, who listen to the word and follow the best in it. That's Surah 39, verse 18. In essence, the Quran affirms its own policy and it puts the onus on us to seek its best meanings, which I believe gives Muslims the permission to keep exploring the horizon of ethical possibilities inherent in our scripture through the ages. As you can imagine, this reading has its own share of critics who have called it, sometimes along with that of Hudud's, text fundamentalism, hermeneutical acrobatics, dishonest, and textual manipulations. Furthermore, in the view of some of these critics, not only should, and I quote Aisha Hidayatullah, the Quran itself be held responsible for its sexist and harmful readings, but it may not even be God's word. So I want to look at these arguments in the order in which different scholars made them. Ibrahim Musa says that looking to the Quran for norms of authority is text fundamentalism, which he defines as, I quote him, the fiction that the text actually provides the norms and we merely discover the norms. The truth, he states, is that we make the norms in conversation with the revelatory text, end quote. And yet, having made this point, he says that the Quran, quote, advocates patriarchal norms since that was the historical condition in which it was revealed, and that it is preferable to hear it in its patriarchal voice. These are his words. In his view, therefore, again I quote him, glossing the text with anti-patriarchal virtues is not the warrant of liberation or egalitarianism. If anything, it is nothing short of hermeneutical acrobatics or a hermeneutics of wishful thinking, end quote. Among the feminists who share Musa's convictions is Kishali, who considers the Quran androcentric because of its provisions on sex, which she then takes as a reason to question its divinity. She starts by noting that its verse on sex, I quote, contain no appeal for female freedom to act, but treat women as matter to be acted upon, end quote. And she ends up stating that, I quote, its treatment of women as sexually passive and men as sexual actors, of women's bodies as other and men's bodies as normative, poses a challenge to understanding the text as purely divine and transcendent, end quote. In other words, she disputes the Quran's sacrality on the basis of her own reading of some verses. Ali is also critical of feminists and reformists, whom she accuses of having a reductive view of Islam because they equate, according to her, they equate it with the Quran. Furthermore, and without giving examples, she declares that, I quote, progressive approaches to the Quran cannot be limited to selective presentation of egalitarian verses in isolation from their broader scriptural context. Such an approach is both fundamentally dishonest and ultimately futile. I find this an interesting critique because she arrives at her own reading by refuting these standard interpretive methods, such as deriving principles from verses or reading the Quran intratextually or contextually. Thus, she says one can't apply the strategy of principle extraction to its provisions on sex because it would raise the problem of competing principles. And as an example, she contrasts the principles of love in a marriage with the concept of mens kivama. And she says that there is no basis to choose between these two principles. In other words, she suggests that being kavamun rules out love in a marriage. I can't say I have still figured this one out. Given this criticism, it's also not clear to me how she herself extracts the principle of androcentrism from the Quran. In passing, I will say that the term androcentric means treating males and maleness as the standards for defining females and femaleness, which the Quran never does. Lastly, Ali argues that we can't read the Quran's provisions on sex historically, since these are, quote, in a key sense ahistorical, though she doesn't explain what makes them ahistorical, and in fact, she even admits that notions of sex and sexuality have, quote, always been historically determined. Then there is Aisha Hidayatullah, who echoes Musa's view that readings like mine and Wadud's reinforce, I quote, a form of Quranic authority that ultimately renders us passive readers of the text. And she echoes Ali's observation that men, not women, are in control of sexual relations in the Quran. And she takes this fact to mean that there, I quote her, functional inequality perhaps cannot exist except as an effect of ontological inequality. And this then leads her to declare that there is, quote, a permanent difference of being in the Quran. Indeed, a large part of her argument is contingent on reversing some of my claims and methodology. So I will give some examples here too. For instance, she says that the problem with thinking that, quote, since God is just and the Quran is the word of God, so then the Quran must also be just, is that, quote, if we cannot be sure that the text upholds the justice we seek, then we are left to question whether the Quran is really a divine text. If we do not question the divinity of the Quran, then we are left to question whether God is just. And On the basis of this argument, she then says that, quote, we should stop appealing to the authority of a text that cannot definitively support our demands for feminist justice, end quote. To my rejoinder that pitting God's word and justice against one another simply results in a false theological paradox, Hidayatullah replies, this is a long quote, that whereas Barlas views the problem of deriving unjust meanings from the Quran as well as its solution as hermeneutical, I see both as primarily theological. By this she means she takes, quote, interpretive contradictions to be symptoms of a problem with how we understand what kind of revelatory text the Quran is. Since the problem is theological, so must its solution be theological, end quote. So what is her solution? It is for feminists to reassess the Quran's nature, just like the early Muslim theologians did, who she says debated its createdness. In other words, she seems to think that the Mu'tazila's doctrine of the created Quran disputed its status as God's word, which isn't so. And here I also want to mention the work of Raja Rooney, who is the precursor. She's situated before Ali and Hidayatullah, in fact, but I mention her in the end because she was also of the same opinion as Hidayatullah, and Hidayatullah is in fact borrowed from her. So Rooney is a Moroccan feminist, and she is a follower of the late Nasser Abu Zaid, with whom she shares a view of the Quran as, I quote, originally an oral discourse involving divine and human communication, rather than a divinely authored text that has been revealed to all humanity, regardless of its context of production or historicity. Simply put, the Quran is just a historical text, not necessarily God's word. This being so, Rooney believes that it isn't un-Islamic to revisit, quote, the concept of the word of God or revelation. And she thinks that doing so will be a good corrective to readings like mine, which postulate that gender equality is normative in the Quran. To put it even more simply, she thinks that rethinking the Quran will offer Muslims, quote, a way out of using religious texts as repositories of truth from which we can retrieve an egalitarian Islam, end quote. And lastly, she also takes the Mu'tazila's doctrine of the created Quran as an argument against its sacrality, even though what the Mu'tazila were asserting was that God and God's speech were of the same divine substance. In other words, that God created God's speech. And this is too long and esoteric of a debate, and I still can't wrap my head around it quite. So let me just say that the Mu'tazila not only took the Quran to be God's speech, but they were known to have been, quote, staunch scripturalists. I think that is gold's highest term. So to conclude, like the Muslim mainstream, secular feminists also take the Quran to be an irrefutably patriarchal text, which they believe can't be reread or recontextualized, a view that shows no understanding of scriptural hermeneutics or, for that matter, interpretive theory in general. However, unlike the Muslim mainstream, they dispute the Quran's status on their own authority, which reveals no understanding of Islamic theology. Indeed, I have called their approach anti-theological because, after all, what would Islam become if we were to rethink the Quran along the lines they advocate? And since most Muslims will reject such a strategy, why do they even prescribe it? And if they don't care about the beliefs of the majority, what stake do they have in what observant Muslims believe? So this is where the disciplinary field of Quranic studies is today. To put it in some perspective, when I began my own journey with the Quran at 16, I hadn't come across a single book by a woman on Islam or the Quran. And even when I began my own in 1995, there were only a few essays by Rifat Hassan and Aziza Al-Hibri on some Quranic verses. And as I kind of indicated, it was only after I had finished my first draft that Wadud's book came out. So all of this to say that no one gave me a blueprint for my reading of the Quran. And in fact, it's not a book I was even trained to write, as the professor has mentioned. But I did so as a testimonial to my own faith and as an existential response to what I saw as the suffering of Muslim women in the name of being good Muslims. Today, though, there is a thriving field of Quranic studies by women, and on top of it, it's easy to access women's scholarship from around the world while sitting at home, as you're doing right now, thanks to the internet. So the question for your generation is, what will you do with all this knowledge? I ask because in the 25 years I've been talking about believing women, I've met less than a dozen Muslims who had read the Quran cover to cover. Though this didn't keep some of them from yelling at me or telling me off for my ideas. Frankly, I don't know what it means to be an observant Muslim if one doesn't know the God one is called on to worship, nor how one can know this God without reading God's word. Having said this, I believe younger Muslims, many of you in the audience, I hope, are looking to engage Islam in more spiritual, liberatory, and meaningful ways than your predecessors have done. And I'm hoping that this desire will allow you to figure out the nature of your own participation in this process. As for the Quran, it has always called on Muslims to use our own aql and ilm to find better ways to read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Barlas. I mean, this was it was a short lecture, but still packed with ideas, and you really, raised more questions than answers, and in a way provoked us to sort of go back and read Quran. And it's very interesting how you began by talking about the way we confuse signifier with signified, and a lot of problems arise out of this confusion between signifier and signified. Then you talked about linguistic masculinization, which is also interesting and intriguing, because when we read Quran, most of us do not know Arabic language, so we access it only through translation. And most of these translators and tafsir writers are, it's a male dominated domain. So we access it through the patriarchal interpretation, through the lens of patriarchal interpretation. So that's a constraint that most of us have when we access Quran. So this linguistic masculinization, how do we overcome this? How do we transcend this barrier is a question that most of us face. Then you talked about Tawheed, which I've read your other works also in your essays, where you consistently speak about how Tawheed is a non-binaristic approach, undercuts the notion of gender binary and male-female hierarchy, etc. So in a way, Quran cannot uphold gender hierarchy as it is presented to be. So all these ideas, and then coming to the critique, secular feminist critique that you listed, which is also interesting, and some of their ideas also appear in Whiting. For example, Aisha Hidatullah, who says that when you, on the one hand, you talk about yourself as a believing woman, a Muslimah, and then you critique Quran. So in a way, it could be a willful reading in which it's not based on the neutral textual interpretation, but rather you are trying to extract from it what you wish to extract from it, because you already begin from a position of a believer. So these are questions that most of us are confronted with, and it's very fascinating. And I'm sure there would be many questions in the minds of the audience. So I look forward to these questions and more answers from you, and more to hear more from you. And I'm also very thankful to Amina for arranging this lecture, as we get to hear you. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. I can just go on and on. I mean, I have so many questions in my mind, but then I'll wait for the audience to ask questions. So over to you, Amina. Please, the questions.
Professor Nishad, can I just answer a little bit of what you said about Hidayatullah's view that as a believer, the fact of the matter is that it's not just as a believer. The very discipline of hermeneutics speaks about pre-understanding, that you bring into the process of interpretation. But the point isn't that we can come to any text from a neutral position, that is for sure. But as biblical scholars have argued, as Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher, has argued, it doesn't have to be biblical. As they say, a text is a limited field of interpretive possibilities, and you can read it to suit yourself only so far. Those were the exact words of Hans Fey, a German biblical scholar. So the point is that that's the field of hermeneutics, which is to allow us to understand the ways in which our subjectivity shapes our encounter with the text. So the point isn't to come from some objective space that's so neutral. That's impossible. The point is to be more aware of what it is that you're bringing into the reading, the biases, the pre-understanding, the presuppositions. And this is a challenge. Nobody has it right just off the bat. You struggle with the text. And the point is that you, quote, unrealize yourself before the text, that it is a mutual encounter. The text is not passive. But you can't read everything into the text either. There's a verse in the Quran which says, there are the illiterates who read into the text their own desire, and they do nothing but conjecture. This is in the Quran. So when I make an argument, I can give you examples from the Quran as to where I'm coming from. If I say God is not a male, I can tell you why. It's not just because I'm a Muslim, I am just, So, and as far as language is concerned, of course, Arabic is gendered. And the first time I said God is not a male, this was in 99, when my book was had just been submitted to the press. I was speaking at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and a bunch of Pakistani boys almost spat on me. They were yelling in my face, Allahu, the Quran says Allahu. And I kept saying, that's language about God. It doesn't matter, because the Quran is also saying, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid, wa lam yulad, wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. There is none like unto God. So these questions that you raise are universal issues with which we can, wrestle, not just with the Quran, but with any text. So, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to take it from here, unless Professor Nishad, you have something to reflect on.
No, I have a lot of things to reflect on, but then we will just go on.
We have 1 eye on the clock.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to, we're going to open into a Q&A also now, but I have a few remarks that I want to share, because, Professor Barlas, listening to you this evening, it has, definitely, it has reminded me how your work, it continues to unsettle and inspire, and also reframe how we think about Islam, women, and Quran. And your whole the Tawheedic paradigm which you use, and also Amina Wadud also works in the same paradigm, this whole idea of the oneness of God, the inseparability of that oneness of God with justice, that a just God, as you keep saying, cannot sanction the subjugation of women. I mean, who can argue with such a compelling argument, logic? I think this is one of the most radical intervention in the Quranic hermeneutics. That patriarchy lies not in Quran, but of course in the interpretive tradition, the traditional exegesis, which have been seen through, the male authority. This act of unreading, that you have, done for us today, and also in your work, I think it's not only theological, and elsewhere you have also talked about it. I think it's also decolonial, right? Because you're not only resisting the internal colonization, of patriarchy, but also the external claim that Muslim women must be saved from their own faith. The whole fact that Islam is not compatible with modern modernity and we need to secularize Islam, and there has been so much written and done. It's an exercise that has been, I'm sorry, I have to admit again, people, and done. So I think crucially, especially in today's day and time, Islamophobia, which is defining Muslims from outside, and this patriarchal authority, which is diminishing women from inside. I think your work gives an alternative grammar of resistance, that is rooted in belief. And it speaks to me personally, it resonates very deeply with me. And I'm sure it does with many other women who have started this journey of, of their understanding and encounters, as subjects of God, I have to keep, yeah. So this is interesting. Now, yet what is most striking that that you insisted, and also Professor Zaidi has pointed out, is the fact that your own refusal, to be really labeled as feminist, while people will, place your work within the larger domain of, Islamic feminism, but you have resisted that labeling very conscientiously. You oppose it, and I think that refusal is interesting, because you're not opposed to feminism, as you say. It is, of course, you've gained from it, but the fact that you refuse the secular and colonial categories, that define Muslim women's intellectual labor. And I find that refusal very strategically decolonial. Also, here I'm reminded of something that I want to add. This is something very personal, actually. In my earlier conversations with Professor Amina Wadood, she told me that all her work, her scholarship, her, her struggles and her intervention, she said that all of it came ultimately out of love. And today, you mentioned here today in the lecture, and the earlier also, I've heard you saying that your scholarship is not a critique, it's a testimony of your faith. So when I look at these categories of faith, and love, as in yours and Vadood's, it's interesting that these are not private, or, passive, categories that can be dismissed, but these are the sources of the most radical intervention. So I see that decoloniality is not about resisting these Western categories or the Eurocentric labels, but also about reclaiming the most intimate source of our being as believing subjects. So that is very, very important to me. Your scholarship is of course, it's more than faith, it is also courage, I would say. And now, after this, we have lots of questions, and we want to stick to the time also. So I want to open these questions. I mean, linguistic masculinization is something that you addressed, and also, Professor Zaidi just pointed out. It's interesting. We know that, you open the text, as a liberatory text that comes very clearly. The fact that Allah is genderless, the fact that God has no gender, the fact that God is unsexed, God is uncreated. Not only that, the fact that God also does not have similitude. You just recited the surah. Now, what I'm interested is knowing that you have, of course, addressed this question earlier, I'm sure many times, is the fact that God does introduces God's self with the masculine pronouns, this whole huwa and hiya. So we have huwa for God and not hiya. Now, one can argue that Arabic as a language it's a gendered language, and Allah's choice of huwa is not Allah's identification of that can't be true, that goes against the tawheed. But at the fake, it is the Arabic gendered nouns, right? One can argue that, but then, as Professor Zaidi earlier pointed out, and this is something that we really need to reckon with in the Quranic studies, is that the most of us get the message of God through translations, right? Muslims, non-Muslim alike. Arabic is a foreign language, and English is really deficient in translating, as like most languages are. The problem, however, though, is that English is gendered neutral language. So the huwa of Arabic, which may not be essentially masculine, but when it's get translated into English as the he, what happens is that the grammatical gender is imposed on the biological. It connotes a biological gender, and that is very confusing. And also today in our society, we're increasingly more aware of these gender neutral terminologies. So I just want you to reflect. I know you have dismissed this as a bad linguistic convention earlier, but this is more than that. And so how do we resolve, or how do we fix that? Should we go on to the general neutral terminologies altogether? But then again, that would be inaccurate representation. Or should we switch? There is a suggestion, let's switch between he and she, which is neither of it is accurate. So how to resolve this? Because once we keep saying he, and all the attributes of Allah goes with this, hyper masculinized, then psychologically it is very problematic. So how do we how, in your way, I want you to reflect on this a little bit.
Wow. We should have a session of our own, and where we should have a 24-hour session. I just want to say that I just say God. Allah was the God. It's a pre-Islamic term. And as people who do semiotics have argued that it was given an Islamic meaning. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. It does come out of history. So this notion of how to refer to God has also been there before I came along with it amongst Christian theologians, because they have the same issue. And some of them have resolved it by she, he and she, but you're saying that still remains within human frameworks. I have no solution to it. The way I deal with it is I repeat God every single time. I don't take a shorthand. Allah, I don't use Allah that much because I speak English. And yes, to me, God is the more familiar term. And God itself is masculine. It's not goddess. But the point is that for me, honestly, if I were to speak completely from my heart, and I shouldn't when I'm being recorded, it's like, I don't care about the language. I try and imagine a God who is above it. And I cannot imagine that God, because the Quran says God is above the highest evolved thought of insan. This is a being that we cannot even conjecture. So I'm okay with saying God. Khudavan Ta'ala, I sometimes say, Ya Mawla, Ya Kareem, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim. There are 99 names of God that which are attributes: the merciful, the loving, the kind, the forgiving, the oft-returning, the subtle. So this is how I do it for myself. So I don't have an academic way of dealing with this. The language is there, but if I have to say God 6 times over instead of he, and his, I will do it. That's not a way out, but that is still a shift in how we think about it, because people have to pause at that repetition. Because once we say he, his, it just becomes normalized in a way. So when I quoted some of these verses, you saw I said God is God, God, God. And in the original translation, it's he. Arabic is gendered, all languages are gendered. Maybe we'd have to be indigenous people to have a language that's not gendered. The question is, how do we want to conceptualize this God? Not how do we want to force this view on somebody else. But you're right, that the language also matters. It matters a lot. And Christian theologians and Jewish theologians have been struggling with it much before folks like me came along. Professor Chris Hewer is nodding his head. And so I just love to hear why you figure out why you're nodding your head. What do you agree with?
You want to respond?
I'm sorry for nodding my head.
No.
I do exactly what you do, and that is I try to use God instead of masculine or feminine pronouns, because I think exactly if you continue to use masculine pronouns, it forms a consciousness, which I don't want to do. So that's why I'm nodding my head. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think we'll move to more questions in the chat box. And this one is about, this is from a student, and she wants to know that you have mentioned before not to confuse men's oppression with God's wrath. However, if there is an omnipotent God present who is not intervening in the oppression committed by man, so how do we see, God not complying the inequality? So these are students. I want you to reflect, Professor.
Well, in philosophy, the question is that if there is a just and merciful God, then there would be no oppression on earth. I just can't buy that, because God is not a partisan with all of us. I mean, this is not a buddy God on my shoulder just doing my bidding. That's a very debased view of the divine. There's no sense that, everything bad that happens because of God's will, because that means where are we in committing genocide? Where are we in oppression? Where are we in misogyny? God is doing all of that. This ain't heaven, that God is responsible for everything. This is the earth, and here we are responsible for ourselves. How can we call ourselves moral agents if everything that we see, we say, oh, if this injustice exists because it's God's will? We can't know God's will. We have to struggle to know God's will. And the idea that a malicious God is there, allowing malicious things to happen, is a very pre-Islamic view, when the gods would get involved in human affairs. The Greek and Roman gods were basically sleeping with the human people and with the animals, and just throwing thunderbolts at folks and punishing folks. And that's not the kind of God I believe in. I believe in a God who's just and merciful, but who has given human beings the free will to make, decisions between right and wrong. So yes, don't I wish that God would punish all of these oppressors? Yes, I do. But I cannot know God's wisdom. I can do what I can do. So this is all I can say,
So shall we move on to the next one? This is by Javed Hussain from the Educational Studies. And he says that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan famously declared that there must not be any difference between the God's words and the word and God's world. So with this as one of the main principles for interpretation, he attempted a tafsir-e-Quran. How do you find his translation if you have gone through it? And is it again a patriarchal he wants to know, or is it more egalitarian? And also some comments he would like you to comment on the limits of the hermeneutics and epistemological constructivism.
I have not read Sayyid Ahmed's translation, and I'm not sure I understand the limits of hermeneutics and constructivism. I have no idea. Would this person like to sort of clarify what they have in mind? I mean, by limits of hermeneutics, every discipline has limits. There's no discipline that doesn't have some limits and some conventions. So I'm not sure what it is. What is the subtext of this question? I don't know.
So, but
you're muted.
Sorry. Talking about hermeneutics, Professor, I would like you to reflect on the idea of double hermeneutics, which you have also used, and something that you said influenced by Fazlur Rahman. So maybe you can tell us about this double hermeneutics, and also the concept of recontextualization. I find that very interesting.
Fair enough. So a text is not a dead thing. A text is a living thing. And the context of a text isn't just when it was written, but also when it is being read. So for example, we read Aristotle today, or we read Plato today. We are not reading it in ancient Greece. We're reading it now. Every time we read a text, we might come to it, obviously, with new insights, different insights, because, we are far removed from the original context of the text. So reading before the text, as feminists put it, means making it relevant to our understanding. We take from text what applies to us. But the very process of reading itself brings the text into where we are. We can read Plato sitting in our home today. You don't have to be an ancient Greece to do that. When you read it with a different perspective, maybe, because you're living in the here and now. The simple act of reading something means that it has more than one context. Recontextualizing the Quran means that by reading it in the present and the here and now, we can also read it in light of new insights. To give you one small example, I read the creation narrative in the Quran like Rifat Hassan does, which is as establishing the ontic equality of women and men. Because what does it mean for God to create the human being from a single self? Now, there are two narratives in the Bible as well, I believe. That there is one in which God created a human being sideways, like from one entity. Then there's the other narrative which says God created Eve from Adam's rib, extracted her. So there are two creation narratives in the Bible. In the Quran, there is one. We created you out of a single nafs and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. And the best of you is the one who's the best in conduct, so on and so forth. So what is the single self? If this is ontic equality, can we not take this as a basis for interpreting other verses? Now, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, it's wrong to expect exegetes to have understood the notion of ontic equality. We can't fault them for their patriarchal readings because they also read the Quran in the context of their own times. So, for Fazlur Rahman, the double hermeneutic meant that we begin by reading the Quran in the present and the here and now. But in order to understand the intent of some of the verses, we need to understand the context in which they were revealed. So then we go back to the history of the Quran. We read behind the text, as feminists put it. What was the historical condition in which it was revealed? Then we begin to understand the significance of some of the verses and why they are the way they are. For example, why idribu? In a society, Laila Ahmed has written this book on gender in Islam, and she talks about how, if a wife contradicted her husband, he could break her teeth with burnt bricks or throw her in a lake or kill her. So we're speaking of these terribly violent, misogynistic societies. So over there, maybe idribu meant a restraint. That's Amina Wadud's argument, that it was a measure of last resort, fourth. So that's reading behind the text. So you go from the present to the past, but then you have to return to the present because even historically contingent and specific verses can yield certain principles. So this is what a double hermeneutics is and what it means to recontextualize the Quran. I read those verses that feminists read as male privileging as actually not male privileging because taken in the times in which they were revealed, there's nothing like them anywhere in the world. But Muslims have gotten stuck on a past Arab-focused reading of the Quran and they refuse to budge. In our part of the world, Muslims are convinced that Arabs are somehow closer to God. There is a joke in Pakistan that an Arab man got lost somewhere. This is a joke in Pakistan, and he arrived at some mosque and he was trying to ask directions, and the people didn't understand Arabic, and so they were confused. So he cussed them off in Arabic, and they all fell behind him to say their prayers because he thought he's speaking Arabic, so he must be God's. This is fetishism. Or Muslim women are starting to wear Arab dress in Pakistan. These are fetishistic things. So, but that's a separate thing. I always get derailed. But anyway, every discipline has its limitations. You can only make yourself aware of what those limitations are. Hermeneutics is not just some magic key that opens the door. It involves struggling with a text to make meaning out of it. But when the Quran says that listen to the best in it, I think it opens the door to acknowledging that maybe we are not always doing the best in it, that it has more than one meaning, that its meanings can't always be fixed. The notion of modesty may change over time. It's not wearing Arab women's dress that makes you modest. So I don't know that this answers the theoretical question about hermeneutics, if I have understood it, but I hope it's clarified what a double hermeneutic movement is. From the present to the context of the Quran to understand why, and then back to the present to see how can we make that relevant today. There are Muslims who, my husband is a convert to Islam. He was praying in a mosque in Pakistan. And somebody praying behind him leaned over and started to turn up his trousers from the back. Because he said the Prophet prayed with his trousers turned up. It's like, excuse me, the Prophet did not wear trousers in the 7th century. He wore Arab dress. Do you see where I'm going? Obscurantism.
We also have, while there are lots of questions coming right now in the chat box, we also had some of the questions we collected before the lecture through Google Forms, and I want to address.
I did read them.
Yes, so I want to, and I think you have actually, answered most of the question. In fact, your lecture was not so much about your own work, but then how you map the entire scholarship around it in the Quranic studies. And you mentioned Hidayatullah and this whole feminist tafsir that she talks about. But more than that, we're more interested in your perspectives right now. So. So believing, so this is the question that I'm picking up from the pool of questions that we had collected earlier. So Believing Women was published in 2002. So I want to know, it was of course a turning point in the field, but have you witnessed a change in the way your work is received today in 2025? I mean, it has been 2 decades later. So also you started, as you said, the field was relatively new. So what changes have you witnessed? And also with the 3rd generation of Muslim women, so can you just reflect maybe?
Okay. I am really bad with technology, but I just saw the question of Dr. Roshanara. And so can I answer that?
Yes,
quickly?
yes, please. Have you seen
Which
it?
is that no religion.
Questions online and offline, yes.
One thing I would like to share is that no religion wants women should be uncovered. All nuns cover their body. Covered women look modest. Please comment.
Okay.
Yeah, you made an obvious point, Dr. Roshan. Yeah,
Dr. Roshanara is the head of the Department of Women's Studies from University of Kashmir.
Okay.
And she has also switched on her camera, so you can see her. She's joining us from Kashmir.
I am actually looking at her. So
Hi,
I was saying
that. Thank you. Thank you.
I was saying that you're right, that women, they want women to be covered. But here's what I want to tell you. The Quran doesn't say that women should cover their bodies because their bodies are pudenda. Pudenda means sexual object. The Quran doesn't say women should cover their bodies so that men won't be tempted. The Quran doesn't say women should cover their bodies because their bodies are polluting and evil. The Quran doesn't say the devil enters the world through the body of the woman. The Quran doesn't say that menstruating women should be removed from the house and put separately. The Quran makes no claims about women's bodies. When it speaks about menstruation, it says it is an adhan for the women, a trial for the women. Leave them alone. It doesn't say they're unclean. It doesn't say the blood is unclean. Yeah, so absolutely. There are different reasons for covering. So I'm interested in the reasons. That's what should matter. So yeah, I mean, Christian misogyny, Jewish misogyny seeped into Islamic misogyny and Muslim misogyny because they were what a Jewish author has called Haval Lazar. I've forgotten her name. I'm so sorry. She called it intertwined worlds. And so, ideas have gone back and forth, and Muslims borrowed a lot from what was already existing. Now, of course, if you say, I'm speaking of equality, it's like, oh, you're very Western. It's like, wait a minute, you borrowed all the nasty ideas from the West. You don't have a problem with that. But if I speak about equality, that's suddenly Western. So what do you make of the Quran's notions of equality? These are really complicated debates because people use the Quran as a weapon They have weaponized religion to shut other people up. This is not the basis for worship. This is not a basis for piety, because worship and piety mean you don't go around telling other people all of this kind of nonsense. Anyway, as to how the book is received today, your generation has been more generous with it. Your generation has definitely been more generous with it in some ways. Because, as I said, I saw this in Granada. And, when I did that talk, this podcast, I mentioned that in Granada, he was part of a school on Islam and decoloniality for several years. And Muslims your age are looking to experience Islam in a different way than they were brought up to experience. They want spirituality, they want meaning, they want elevation, they want a connection, they want to know the God they worship. And I've lived long enough to know that all of the arguments I've had with Muslim men, nasty when I've had them at all, because most of them don't want to speak with me. It's not about God. It's about male authority. They will tell you. But it's not about worshiping God, being pious, and minding your own business. When the Quran says, let there be no compulsion in religion, what is it saying? But today we've become each other's moral minders. Yes, the Quran says that you're awliya, you guide each other. But we no longer guide each other. We have very few conversations like you and I and all of us are having. Usually it's a one-way thing. You get to hear the dominant position, and if you answer back, you get to hear about it. Anywho.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. But one thing I would like to, discuss here in this very esteemed forum, that hijab and women, it is becoming a debate worldwide, right? But hijab is no longer, it is not an obstacle in the empowerment of women. A hijabi woman has become a pilot. A hijabi woman is a best doctor. She is a judge. She is everything. But I don't know why there is a debate on it and why this is a subject of debate. And if a woman covers her body, it should not be a concern for men. Why they should comment? Why they should comment? It is their own will. It is their own will because they are not being forced. And so far as the empowerment of women is concerned or the equality is concerned, I am pretty sure, and I affirm it, that Islam is the religion where women are getting more empowerment because they are getting a due share of their property, of their parents, of their husbands. And then again, as a mother, she is being given such a super status that heaven lies under her feet. Therefore, I think if we talk about empowerment, this is a new phenomenon for new generations. But if we look back about our, Muslim women in the whole world, you see the women of Saudi Arabia, they are more empowered than men. But it is the question, patriarchy has been responsible in every religion. If we talk about Christianity, we talk about Hinduism, we talk about any religion, patriarchy is there. Male dominance is there. We cannot deny that. But we should not make it a subject that whether women should cover or not. Because women are not questioning men's dress. Therefore, men have no right to question what women should wear or what they should not.
So there are only two verses on covering in the Quran, two. One is to say that, women who go out into the public arena can wear a jilbab to differentiate themselves from those in whose hearts is a disease. They won't molest them. The context of the verse is that at that time, slaves were not allowed to cover themselves. You will remember that Mahatma Gandhi, when he was alive, actually took part in a movement to allow the Dalit women to cover themselves because they were not allowed to cover their breasts. Mm-hmm. So the point was that at that stage, when the Muslims were a small minority, Muslim women were supposed to identify themselves by wearing a jilbabs to set themselves off from the slaves. Why? Because slaves could be molested in the public arena. That's the historical context. It wasn't because men will be titillized or the man have the right to tell women. It's though that verse is addressed to the Prophet. It's not addressed to all men. The second verse in the Quran also addressed to the Prophet. Tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their modesty, and tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their modesty. I never hear about male modesty, not once. So this covering is, and a random man, somebody slapped some woman somewhere in Pakistan or Morocco or somewhere because her head was not covered. He had nothing to do with her. This is just misogyny. This is misogyny, and this is a lot of male hatred against women. And it is historical, it is still there. And the only thing I would say, Dr. Roshan, is that personally, I don't compare religions. I don't think it's useful. Because Muslims do that to make themselves feel superior, that, oh, Islam gave women rights, men, blah. It's like, but your Muslim societies haven't given women zero rights. So don't talk to me about what Islam did in the 7th century if you're not willing to do it now. So I don't want to put down any women or any religion or elevate anybody, but I agree with you. They have no right. The Quran doesn't give them the right to tell women how to dress. When it says that everybody is responsible for themselves, it means you and I are responsible for ourselves. My father is not, my son is not, my husband is not, and my brother is not.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
You're asking me questions that are getting me worked up.
Okay, so I think we'll just stop it there, Professor. I know these are provocative and controversial.
No, I love them. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm loving it all.
We do not
What
want
I'm
you to
saying
get worked up, and we've already taken more.
I'm always worked up anyway. Don't worry.
We've taken more time than we asked for, actually, and the questions keep pouring in, and we haven't even addressed all the pre-lecture questions. But this is.
I'm happy to correspond with any of the students who want to write to me directly. You can share
there are
my
many
email with them.
questions. There are many questions in the chat box, as I can see. Amina, you can collate them and post them to Dr. Barlas, and she can
Absolutely.
then.
We will. I will send the questions. We can email it to you, and we can continue this discussion and continue to work you up later on. But I just probably there are not only just questions, as you can see, there are lots of congratulatory messages.
Okay,
also.
I should be able to see this. I haven't so far been able to click on this.
The
and
questions.
I because see, I can either talk to you or read the thing.
Oh, you don't have to worry about it, Professor. I'm going to send the questions. I will send.
I would love to have it all.
I think, Dr. Amina, you can share the screen on screen right now, those messages, if you want to.
Well,
that is fine. That is fine. I think we will close the session as we planned. And Amina,
yes.
Please go ahead with the program.
So I just want.
All right, no issues.
So I can see the enthusiasm, but we have to stick to the time, and knowing that also you've not been feeling well, so we're not going to hold you beyond the time. Now, what I probably just want to end with this one thing that is that struck me a lot, that you started your lecture with 434, the most controversial, the most talked about, and this is the verse where even Amina Wadud kind of gives up and says, calling it a faith-based objection. And she says it's a conscientious, pause. She takes a conscientious pause. But in your analysis of the overarching egalitarian worldview of Quran, in putting Quran in the center, as you said, in the front and behind, you're able to answer these where, many others have kind of, given up. So I like that approach is something which is in itself very liberatory. And thank you so much. I would just like to call now Arushi, our student, who wants to present formal vote of the thanks, with which we end today's session. Arushi, are you there?
Yes, I can see you.
Yes, Arushi. Thank you.
Good evening to everyone present here. It's a privilege to be here on the behalf of Sarojini Naidu Center for Women Studies to extend our heartfelt appreciation at the closing of this enriching session. To begin, we express our sincere gratitude to our Chief Patron, Professor Masar Asif, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia, for his steadfast support and encouragement for our academic pursuits. Our thanks also to Professor Mahtab Alam Rizvi, Registrar of Jamia Millia Islamia, whose consistent guidance and motivation continue to inspire initiatives such as this. A very special thank you to Professor Asma for joining us today and sharing such a powerful and intellectually stimulating lecture. Your reflections on the Quran and believing in an egalitarian and anti-patriarchal stance, carving a space for women within it, has been revolutionary, to say the least. It has helped us decolonize, as Dr. Amina has said, our own relationships with faith and indigenous knowledge. It has truly been an honor to learn from your scholarship, ma'am. We are also grateful to Professor Nishad Zaidi, the Honorary Director of our Center, for her visionary leadership and unwavering commitment to giving her students the best chance at engaging with meaningful academic conversations. Ma'am, your dedication to creating these spaces remain the driving force behind all that we do. We are also thankful to Dr. Amina Hassan, who coordinated this lecture series with such thought and precision, making it possible for us to interact with distinguished voices in the field. Our warm thanks to the faculty and staff of our center for their constant support, and also to the student team, especially Preeti, for ensuring everything ran smoothly. Finally, to all the participants, research scholars, teachers, students, and colleagues from within Jamia and beyond, thank you for your enthusiastic involvement and questions that you have posed here. Your presence and contributions made this discussion vibrant and meaningful. We deeply appreciate your time and engagement, and we look forward to welcoming all of you to many more conversations in the future. Have a wonderful evening or day ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wadu. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Mutual
you so much.
thanks.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure. It was for me too.
You said
Goodbye.
you be able to. You said that you will be able to survive for an hour. I want to say that you actually thrived beyond 1 hour. Thank you so
Good.
much, Professor Barlas.
Thank you. Bless you. Take
Thank you,
care.
everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.